In the bustling streets of Bombay in the 1960s, life never seemed to sleep. Trains thundered through the night, slums crowded with restless bodies, and shadows stretched long under the dim glow of street lamps. But hidden among the noise and movement was a chilling silence. A silence that followed a man with cold, hollow eyes. Night after night, poor laborers and homeless wanderers would lay down to rest on pavements and railway tracks, believing exhaustion would protect them until dawn. Yet many never opened their eyes again. They were found lifeless, their skulls shattered, their blood seeping into the earth. Who was behind this terror? Why did the killings seem random, yet mercilessly precise? And how could one man, armed with nothing more than a rod or a stone, hold an entire city hostage with fear? This is the story of Raman Raghav, the man later called India's Jack the Ripper. His life was a blend of madness and brutality, his crimes a nightmare etched into the heart of Mumbai. Over the next hour, we will step into the shadows of his world, the chaos, the fear, and the strange darkness of a mind that killed without remorse. But be warned, this is not just a story of a killer. It is a story of a city that held its breath each night, of police forces desperate to catch a ghost, and of a nation shocked into confronting the face of evil. So, sit back, let the world outside fade away, and follow me into the forgotten alleys of 1960s Bombay, where death often walked silently in the night. The year was 1929. India was still under British colonial rule, its vast land fractured by poverty and political unrest. In a small, unremarkable village, a child was born into obscurity, a boy who would later become one of the most feared figures in modern Indian crime history. His name was Raman Raghav. Little is known about his early years, and that mystery itself has fueled speculation. What we do know is that he grew up in desperate conditions, surrounded by poverty so crushing that hunger was a constant companion. In those days, villages in India often lacked schools, hospitals, or even proper roads. Families struggled simply to put food on the table, and many children wandered through life untethered, their futures as uncertain as the monsoon rains. Raghav was one of those children. Accounts suggest that he was restless, detached, and even as a boy, he carried a strange sense of isolation. He never seemed to bond with others, preferring instead to wander alone. Neighbors would later recall that his gaze unsettled them, a hollow stare that seemed to cut through flesh and bone. As he grew older, he left his village and drifted toward the big city. Bombay, as it was then called, promised opportunity. It was the jewel of India, a city of booming industries, railways, docks, and slums teeming with migrants. People came with dreams of a better life, but Bombay was merciless. For every man who found work, another was left hungry. sleeping on pavements with nothing but the stars above. Raghav blended into this environment. He was just another face among thousands of poor men roaming the streets. Another wanderer with no steady job and no family to speak of. He survived by odd labor, petty theft, and scavenging. But inside him, a different hunger was growing. The first hints of his dark impulses surfaced quietly. Rumors spread in the slums about a man who threatened others without reason, who carried a rod or a stone in his hand and muttered to himself in the dark. People avoided him, whispering that he was mad. Some said they heard him speak of demons and invisible enemies who needed to be destroyed. Yet nobody could have imagined what lay ahead. By the early 1960s, Bombay was exploding with growth. The textile mills attracted laborers by the thousands, and the city's population swelled. But with opportunity came chaos. Pavements overflowed with men sleeping shoulder to shoulder. Railway tracks became makeshift beds for those who had no homes. In this crowded underbelly, the poor became invisible. Easy prey for someone who knew how to hunt among them. It was here, in these forgotten corners, that Raman Raghav began to shape his identity as a killer. The city didn't notice at first. A dead man in the slums meant little. People died every night, of hunger, of disease, of accidents. But soon the deaths carried a signature too brutal to ignore. Crushed skulls, shattered bones, bodies left in grotesque stillness. Raghav's early killings were sporadic, almost experimental. He struck with stones, rods, or even blunt sticks. He targeted the vulnerable. Men too poor to defend themselves, too weary to fight back. The attacks were swift and merciless, carried out in silence under the cover of night. But behind this savagery lay a mind sinking deeper into madness. He believed he was fighting an invisible army, demons disguised as men. To him, the world was crawling with enemies only he could see. And the only way to survive was to kill them before they killed him. Bombay, a city alive with noise and light, did not yet realize that a shadow had begun to haunt its nights. As dawn broke over the crowded streets, the poor went back to their daily struggle for survival. But beneath the hum of rickshaws and the clatter of trains, whispers were starting to grow. Whispers of fear. Whispers of death in the darkness. And at the center of it all was a man, whose name was not yet infamous, but soon would be. By 1965, Bombay had grown into one of the most chaotic cities on the planet. It was a city of contradictions, gleaming towers beside rotting slums, riches rubbing shoulders with the poorest of the poor, the textile mills, the railways, the docks. All drew thousands of migrants who poured into the city daily. But Bombay could not hold them all. Entire families slept under tarpaulins on the roadside. Men stretched out on railway tracks, their only pillow a rolled-up piece of cloth. For these forgotten souls, the night was not a time of peace. It was a gamble. And into this restless night walked Raman Raghav. At first, no one noticed him. A ragged man, thin and weathered, drifting through the shadows with eyes that seemed lost to the world. He was not unique. There were thousands like him, invisible to the city's middle class. But Raghav carried something far more dangerous than poverty. He carried a sickness of the mind, a hunger that no food could satisfy. The first body was found near the railway line. A laborer, nameless to most, beaten to death with a heavy stone. His skull was crushed so violently that even the police officers, hardened by years of crime scenes, turned their eyes away. At the time, it seemed like a senseless act. Perhaps a drunken brawl gone too far. Perhaps vengeance over a petty quarrel. Bombay was no stranger to sudden violence, but the next body came soon after, and then another. Each victim was poor. Each was found sleeping outdoors, and each bore the same brutal mark. The head smashed in by a blunt object. Fear began to creep in. For the poor, who had nothing to shield themselves, sleep itself became dangerous. Men huddled in groups, afraid to close their eyes alone. Women clutched their children tighter at night, their hearts pounding at every footstep in the dark. The newspapers began to take notice. Headlines spoke of a mysterious killer stalking the slums. The police, overwhelmed by the sheer size of the city, at first struggled to see a pattern, but soon it was undeniable. Someone was hunting the vulnerable, and he was killing with frightening regularity. Raghav had discovered something that gave him power. He learned that in the crowded chaos of Bombay, the poor could die unnoticed. He struck quickly, always at night, always in silence. A stone, a rod, sometimes even a wooden stick. To him, these were weapons as deadly as knives or guns. He crept up on his victims as they slept, lifting the weapon high, and with a single crushing blow, ended their lives. But why? That question haunted investigators. When they finally captured him years later, Raghav would speak of demons. He believed the people he killed were not human at all, but imposters, evil spirits disguised in human form. In his mind, he was not a murderer, but a soldier fighting a secret war against an invisible army. And yet, there was something disturbingly human in his choices. He preyed on the weakest, the forgotten, those who could not fight back. To the rest of the city, he was nearly invisible. To the poor, he was a shadow that could strike at any moment. The killings of 1965 left Bombay rattled. The police combed the slums, questioning beggars, laborers, anyone who might have seen something. But fear kept mouths closed, and the city was too vast for the thin line of officers to cover. Raghav slipped away night after night, blending into the faceless masses. By the time the first wave of killings slowed, dozens had died. The newspapers nicknamed him a psycho killer, a maniac roaming the streets. But among the poor, he was something far more terrifying. A ghost with a stone in his hand. And then, just as suddenly as the terror had begun, it seemed to stop. The killings slowed. The city breathed again, and Bombay returned to its daily rhythm. People forgot, as cities often do, moving on to the next crisis, the next headline. But Raghav had not vanished. He had only grown quieter, waiting, listening to the voices in his head. The demons he imagined were not gone. They were merely biding their time. When he returned, his violence would be even more brutal, his methods more confident, and the fear he would unleash upon Bombay in the years to come would make his first spree seem almost like a rehearsal. The slums of Bombay had been given a warning, a taste of the darkness that lived among them. But no one could have predicted the storm that was still to come. After the killings of 1965, Bombay began to settle back into its noisy rhythm. The city, with its endless trains, its factories puffing smoke into the sky, and its restless crowds, had too many worries to dwell long on fear. Life was cheap in the slums, and for the poor, death was a daily visitor. A body found beaten by the tracks, another sprawled lifeless in a dark alley. These were not unusual sights. For most, the memory of those months of terror began to fade. The newspapers moved on to other headlines: politics, protests, corruption, strikes. The police returned to their regular duties, overstretched and exhausted. The citizens who had whispered about the psycho killer stopped glancing over their shoulders. It was almost as if the city had convinced itself that the nightmare was over. But Raman Raghav had not disappeared. He had merely gone underground, drifting further into the labyrinth of Bombay's underbelly. He walked among the slums, sometimes muttering to himself, sometimes staring into the distance with unblinking eyes. Those who noticed him thought him mad, a harmless beggar, another unfortunate soul swallowed by poverty. Few remembered that in his silence lurked a monster waiting to awaken. For Raghav, the voices in his head never ceased. He believed the world was infested with impostors, men and women who were not human at all but demons wearing masks. In his twisted logic, they had to be destroyed before they destroyed him. It was not murder, he told himself, but survival. During those quiet years, he wandered the city restlessly. He slept wherever he could, sometimes under bridges, sometimes in abandoned huts, sometimes on the very railway lines where his victims once lay. He survived on scraps of food, small thefts, and odd jobs. But always the urge simmered beneath the surface. Every night he listened to the demons whispering. Every day his hatred of the world deepened. Then, in 1968, the killings began again. It started the same way. A body discovered near the railway tracks. The victim, a poor man, had been struck violently on the head. The police shrugged at first. Another fight? Another act of drunken rage? But within weeks, more bodies appeared. and soon the grim pattern became impossible to ignore. The killer had returned. This time, the murders were bolder, more frequent, and far more terrifying. Raghav struck almost every few nights, moving like a phantom through the slums. His victims were again the most vulnerable. Beggars, day laborers, homeless men who lay asleep under the stars. But unlike before, the killings began to spill into different neighborhoods, spreading panic across the city. The fear was immediate and overwhelming. Bombay, with its millions of souls, felt suddenly small, as though death was stalking every alley and every roadside. The poor, who had always slept in the open, now huddled in groups or sat awake all night, their eyes darting at every shadow. Families whispered about the madman who crushed skulls with stones. Mothers warned their children not to wander far. Even the police, toughened by years of crime, spoke of the killings with unease. The press resurrected the name that had once haunted the city, the psycho killer. But this time, the fear spread faster and deeper. People remembered the first spree, and now it was clear. The nightmare had never ended. It had only been waiting. Raghav himself seemed to grow more confident. He no longer needed to hide his compulsion. In his mind, he was on a mission, chosen to rid the world of false humans. The demons were everywhere, and only he could strike them down. Each night, he prowled the city's fringes, a blunt weapon in hand, eyes searching for the next sleeping body. By the middle of 1968, the number of deaths climbed alarmingly. Estimates would later suggest that during this second wave alone, Raghav killed at least 20 to 25 people. Some put the number even higher. What terrified people most was the randomness. There was no motive, no pattern beyond the weapon and the brutality. Anyone could be next. The police launched manhunts, scouring the slums with lanterns, questioning hundreds, arresting dozens of vagrants. But Raghav slipped through their fingers again and again. He was a master of invisibility, blending into the very population he hunted. To the authorities, he was a ghost. To the poor, he was a devil in human form. As the killings mounted, Bombay spiraled into panic. The rich stayed locked in their homes. The poor, with nowhere to hide, lived in constant terror. Each night seemed darker than the last, each dawn a fragile relief. The city was under siege, not from an army, not from politics, but from one man carrying a stone. And still, no one knew who he was. No one knew when he would strike again, but the police were closing in. Whispers on the street began to point toward a strange, ragged man who wandered endlessly, muttering of demons and invisible enemies. His eyes, people said, were unlike anyone else's, empty, cold, and unblinking. The storm was reaching its peak. The hunter was being hunted. And soon, Bombay would come face to face with the man who had terrorized its nights. By mid-1968, Bombay was a city under siege, not by foreign invaders, not by riots or strikes, but by an unseen hand that struck in the night. The poor whispered about a madman with a stone, a shadow that moved through the slums like a phantom. People who had nothing, no homes, no wealth, no protection, were now stripped even of the safety of sleep. The numbers alone were horrifying. Bodies were turning up almost every other night, each marked with the same chilling signature. Skulls crushed with terrifying force. The victims were usually discovered at dawn, sprawled where they had tried to rest, blood pooling into the dirt, faces unrecognizable. For the police, the pattern was undeniable. This was not random violence. This was a systematic slaughter. Fear spread through the city like wildfire. In chawls and shanty towns, men stopped lying down to sleep. Groups huddled together, taking turns staying awake, watching the shadows. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers into the night. Even the most hardened workers, men who had survived hunger and violence all their lives, admitted openly, "There is a devil in Bombay." The newspapers fed the frenzy. "Psycho killer strikes again," one headline read. "Another body found near tracks," said another. Soon, the stories became national news. India at large began to follow the chilling saga, labeling the murderer Jack the Ripper of Bombay. The comparison was apt. A lone figure terrifying an entire city with brutality and mystery. For the Bombay police, the pressure was immense. Commissioner of Police, his face tight with exhaustion, ordered special night patrols. Constables marched through the slums with lanterns and rifles, questioning vagrants, arresting dozens in sweeps. But none of it worked. The killer was always one step ahead, slipping back into the sea of nameless, faceless poor who filled every corner of the city. Meanwhile, Raman Raghav was sinking deeper into his delusions. To him, he was not killing innocents. He was destroying demons, imposters, creatures in disguise. Each time he lifted a stone or an iron rod and brought it crashing down on a sleeping head, he believed he was purging the world of evil. His madness gave him confidence. He moved without fear, convinced that destiny itself was guiding his hand. The killings reached such intensity that Bombay nearly came to a standstill. In certain neighborhoods, people refused to leave their homes at night. Some slept in shifts. Others fled to relatives in different parts of the city. Fear was now as thick as the humid monsoon air. Finally, the police got a break. In late 1968, a patrol in the northern outskirts of Bombay spotted a suspicious man wandering aimlessly near the railway lines. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow. When questioned, he muttered incoherently about people being demons. The constables, already on edge, detained him. That man was Raman Raghav. At first, the police were not certain they had their killer. After all, there were many like him, poor, ragged, mentally unstable. But when they began interrogating him, the truth spilled out in fragments. Raghav admitted to killing, though not in the way the police expected. He spoke of demons that took human form, of voices that ordered him to strike, of a war only he could see. The more he spoke, the more certain the investigators became. They had caught the man who had haunted Bombay's nights. Survivors from the slums who had glimpsed the killer pointed to him. His wandering matched the movements of the crimes, and most damning of all, he described details of the murders that no one else could have known. The city breathed again. Headlines screamed the news. Psycho killer caught. People wept in relief, as though a curse had been lifted. For months, they had lived under the shadow of death. Now, finally, the ghost had a name and a face. But even as the relief spread, the horror deepened. For when the full scope of his crimes was counted, the numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates placed his victims at over 40, though some believed the real figure was far higher. In his madness, Raman Raghav had slaughtered more people than most soldiers in war. And yet, questions lingered. How had one man eluded the police for so long? How many bodies had been missed, buried under the statistics of poverty? And, most haunting of all, was this man truly evil, or merely insane? For now, the terror was over. But the story of Raman Raghav was far from finished. His capture was only the beginning of another chilling chapter. The trial, the psychiatric evaluations, and the debate over justice for a man who claimed he was killing demons. Bombay had survived the storm, but India was about to ask itself difficult questions about madness, responsibility, and the face of evil. The capture of Raman Raghav in 1968 brought Bombay a collective sigh of relief, but the story was far from over. What followed was not just a trial of a man, but a trial of the very boundary between crime and madness. For weeks, India found itself gripped by the courtroom drama that unfolded. A drama unlike anything the nation had seen before. When he was brought into custody, Raghav appeared as he had been found. Ragged, thin, unkempt, with eyes that seemed both vacant and predatory. He did not deny his actions. In fact, when questioned, he admitted to them in chilling detail. Yet, his explanations were more disturbing than the murders themselves. He spoke calmly, almost with pride, of fighting against what he called evil spirits. He insisted that the people he killed were not human beings at all, but impostors, demons disguised in flesh, sent to destroy him. His tone was not that of a criminal trying to excuse his crimes, but of a man who genuinely believed in his delusions. In one session, when asked why he chose his victims, he said plainly, "They were not real people. They were after me. I had to finish them before they finished me." His words sent shivers through the courtroom. The police had hoped for a straightforward conviction. After all, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses had identified him. He had confessed. The bodies bore the brutal signature of his attacks. But the sheer strangeness of his explanations forced the court to consider a deeper question. Was Raghav truly guilty, or was he insane? To answer this, the court ordered psychiatric evaluations. The voices he heard, the demons he believed in, these were not lies. They were the reality his diseased mind forced upon him. The doctors concluded that he had been insane for years, perhaps since childhood, and that his killings were not motivated by greed, revenge, or cruelty in the ordinary sense, but by the hallucinations and delusions that ruled his thoughts. Still, many argued that insanity did not lessen the horror of his actions. 40 lives, perhaps more, had been ended in cold blood. Families had been destroyed. Fear had gripped an entire city. Could such a man be allowed to live? The trial became a national debate. On one side, those who believed justice demanded the death penalty. They argued that, madness or not, Raghav had taken too many lives to be spared. On the other side stood those who believed that executing him would be unjust, for he was not in control of his mind. The courtroom became the battleground for this moral dilemma. Initially, the court sentenced Raman Raghav to death by hanging. It seemed like the only fitting end for a man whose crimes had earned him the title India's Jack the Ripper. The announcement was greeted with applause from many who felt justice had finally been served. But the story took an unexpected turn. The case was appealed, and the higher court reviewed the psychiatric findings more closely. The doctors had been unanimous. Raghav was mentally ill to a degree that he could not fully comprehend the nature of his crimes. Under Indian law, this raised serious questions about responsibility and punishment. After long deliberation, the court made a shocking decision. Raghav's death sentence was overturned. Instead, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, to be spent not in an ordinary prison, but under special care, given his psychiatric condition. The decision split public opinion. To some, it felt like justice had been denied. To others, it was a moment of compassion in the face of unimaginable darkness. Whatever the perspective, the outcome was unprecedented. A man who had slaughtered dozens in cold blood would not hang, but live out his days behind bars. Inside the prison, Raghav remained much the same. Guards described him as quiet, withdrawn, sometimes muttering to himself. He never showed remorse. He continued to speak of demons, of invisible enemies, of the secret war only he could see. The trial and its outcome left behind haunting questions. Was Raghav evil, or was he a victim of a broken mind? Should justice punish, or should it also recognize madness? And most unsettling of all, if a man could kill so many under the grip of insanity, how many more like him walked the streets, unseen and untreated? Bombay had been freed from the terror of the nights, But India was left with a story that blurred the line between crime and illness, between punishment and mercy. And for Raman Raghav, the years in prison stretched ahead. Not an ending, but a slow descent into obscurity, watched over by guards who knew they were keeping one of India's darkest figures alive. After the court overturned his death sentence in 1969, Raman Raghav disappeared from public view. The headlines faded, the frenzy ended, and Bombay returned to its restless rhythm. But behind prison walls, the man who had once held an entire city hostage lived on, locked away for life. Raghav was moved into a secure facility where his mental condition could be monitored. Guards quickly noticed he was unlike other prisoners. He rarely spoke, rarely reacted. Sometimes he sat still for hours, staring at nothing, muttering under his breath. At other times, he paced restlessly, eyes darting as though following invisible enemies. His schizophrenia did not fade with confinement. If anything, it deepened in isolation. He showed no remorse for his crimes. When questioned, he often repeated the same chilling refrain, that his victims had not been real people, but demons sent to destroy him. For him, prison was not punishment. It was simply another battleground in his endless war against the phantoms of his mind. The guards who worked closest to him described him as eerie rather than violent. He was not prone to outbursts like other inmates. Instead, he lived inside his delusions. A man trapped in a world only he could see. Some feared him, while others pitied him. He was, after all, both a killer and a patient. A man destroyed by madness, yet still dangerous in his silence. Years passed, and India changed. Bombay grew into Mumbai. Skyscrapers rose. Technology spread. But within the prison walls, Raghav remained the same. A ghost of the 1960s, frozen in time. New generations of police recruits heard his name in training, learning of the terror he once caused. The lessons of how one man could paralyze a city. Among criminologists and psychiatrists, his case became infamous, a reference point in discussions about mental illness and violent crime. He lived this way for nearly 3 decades. Then, in 1995, at the age of about 66, Raman Raghav died in custody. His end was quiet, unremarkable. No headlines, no outcry. A life that had once dominated the front pages now slipped into history with barely a whisper. Yet his legacy remained. Even after his death, his story haunted Mumbai. For those who remembered the nights of terror in the 1960s, his name was a reminder of how fragile safety could be. For psychiatrists, he was a symbol of the thin line between madness and monstrosity. For criminologists, he was India's most chilling example of a serial killer hiding in plain sight. And for the poor who had lived through those nights, his memory was personal. A shadow that had once stalked their sleep, a nightmare that had taken flesh. Raman Raghav's prison years may have been silent, but his story did not die with him. It lingered, woven into the fabric of India's darkest criminal folklore, a reminder that monsters are not always born. Sometimes they are shaped by madness, poverty, and neglect, until the line between man and demon vanishes entirely. The story of Raman Raghav is not only about murder. It is about the fragile border between sanity and madness, between the human and the monstrous. In the crowded streets of Bombay during the 1960s, he was just another face among millions, a poor, ragged man ignored by the city. But when darkness fell, he became something else. A silent predator, a shadow carrying a stone, a name whispered with fear. He killed without wealth, without weapons of power, without even cunning disguise. His tools were blunt and simple, a rod, a stone, a stick. Yet with them, he brought one of the world's largest cities to its knees. That was his terrifying strength, the ability to transform the ordinary into instruments of horror, to turn the act of sleep itself into a gamble with death. When the police finally caught him, what they found was not a criminal mastermind, but a broken mind. A man haunted by delusions so deep that he could not see his victims as people. He believed himself to be at war, chosen to strike before the demons could strike him. In the eyes of society, he was a murderer. In the eyes of medicine, he was a patient. And in the eyes of those who survived his terror, he was a monster who blurred every line. His years behind bars silenced him, but his presence never left the memory of Bombay. Even decades later, his name lingers in hushed tones, his story retold in books, studies, and chilling conversations. He died in prison in 1995, an old man whose body finally surrendered, but whose crimes remain etched into India's criminal history. What can we take from his story? Perhaps it is a reminder of how easily the forgotten can vanish into madness, how the poor and invisible can become prey not only to society's neglect, but to its most dangerous predators. Perhaps it is also a warning that evil does not always come dressed in power or grandeur. Sometimes it walks barefoot in the slums, ragged and unwashed, muttering to itself in the dark. And so, the city of Mumbai has grown, changed, and transformed. Skyscrapers now rise where slums once stood. The trains still thunder through the night, carrying millions across the city. But somewhere in the collective memory, there lingers a shadow. The shadow of a man who once made the city too afraid to sleep. This has been the story of Raman Raghav, India's Jack the Ripper. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the darkest chapters of Indian history. As you drift into sleep tonight, let this story remind you. The world is filled with light and shadow, hope and fear. But here, in this moment, you are safe. Rest now, and let the night carry you gently. You have been listening to Sleeping Radio.